I'm going to pick on Hollywood because you see this all the time in the movies where a
Yeah.
fugitive is running away, they run down a creek bed and then the dogs can't find them. And that's absolutely not true. Dogs can track amazingly well through water. And our trainer once told me about a bloodhound he had in training, and they were running a practice track. And he told the person to run straight down the creek bed for maybe an eighth of a mile, something like that. It wasn't a huge long distance, but it was a good distance. And then go out the other side, and he would follow the track. And he said that dog followed it perfectly.
Hello, fellow creative voyagers. This week on the Indie Author Podcast, I talk with author Kathleen Donnelly about mistakes writers make about working canines and how to avoid them, including whether a dog can track across water or track a person in a car, whether one scent can be disguised with another, what makes it difficult for a dog to track, and how to evade tracking dogs, maybe, training rescue and human remains dogs, training the alert signal, identifying candidate dogs, when training starts, the role of the handler, what happens if a dog flunks out, the caveat that every agency is different, and how to get more information. And now let's hear from Kathleen Donnelly about mistakes writers make about working canines and how to avoid them. Hello, and welcome to the Indie Author Podcast. Today, my guest is Kathleen Donnelly. Hey, Kathleen, how are you doing?
Hey, I'm doing well. Thanks for having me today.
It is my pleasure. And to give our listeners and viewers a little bit of background on you, award-winning author Kathleen Donnelly has been a handler for Sherlock Holmes Detection K-9s, a Colorado-based narcotics canine company since 2005. Her debut novel, Chasing Justice, won the American Book Fest Best Book Award and a Pencraft Award, and it was the 2023 Silver Falchion finalist in the Suspense category and Reader's Choice Award. She lives near the Colorado foothills with her husband and four-legged coworkers. And I recently interviewed Kathleen for my video series, What I Learned, where she shared some of the lessons that she learned from her novel, Killer Secrets, that she'd like to share with her fellow readers and writers. And as we talked, I realized Kathleen would be a perfect addition for my informal mini series for everyone who reads or writes crime fiction, mistakes writers make, and how to avoid them. And so in the past, I've chatted with experts about firearms, police procedure, coroners, first responders, the FBI, PIs, forensic psychiatry, police roles, bladed weapons, and firefighters. And Kathleen is going to add to that list by talking about mistakes writers make about canines and how to avoid them. And any conversation about canines is good with me. So I think this is going to be super fun. But Kathleen, you and I were chatting a little bit before we started recording, and you said there was kind of a caveat you wanted to add to what we were going to be discussing. Did you want to share that?
Sure, I'll kick off with that because I realize over the years, as I've talked to people about canines or writers, I should say about canines who are trying to research and get it right, as we all work hard to do, is that every agency is a little different. And so, a quick example is I play train my dogs, which means they get a toy as a reward. Whereas, like the ATF food trains their dogs, so their dogs receive food as a reward. And so that's just one example of many of where if you're researching for your book and you want to take this video and expand on it and go out to each individual agency you want to use. So if you're going to use the ATF, reach out to them and find out how they train their dogs and just things like that. So, but this will be a great way to give you some starting points and some great questions to be able to reach out to those agencies and find out more.
And within an agency like the ATF, is that the standard? Like, if you're writing something about ATF, can you assume that's the approach you take, or would different branches of ATF perhaps use different procedures?
That's a great question. And that's a great example of I'm not 100% certain because the bomb dogs are the ones that are for sure food trained.
Mm.
But I believe the ATF also has some dual purpose dogs, meaning those dogs have more than one job. So usually that's apprehension, bomb dog, it could be tracking. And so those dogs might actually be trained differently. Usually the apprehension dogs are trained off of the prey drive and that sort of thing. So that's a great example of figure out what you want your dog to do and then reach out and see if you can connect with someone.
Perfect. So you had kindly sent me a list of some of the things that mistakes writers make that we're going to be talking about. And the first one was one that I had asked you about when we were talking for What I Learned, and that was, can a fugitive cross a creek and have the dog not be able to follow them because the water masks the scent?
Yes, this is a good one. And I'm going to pick on Hollywood because you see this all the time in the movies where a
Yeah.
fugitive is running away, they run down a creek bed and then the dogs can't find them, and that's absolutely not true. Dogs can track amazingly well through water. And our trainer once told me about a bloodhound he had in training, and they were running a practice track. And he told the person to run straight down the creek bed for maybe an eighth of a mile, something like that. It wasn't a huge long distance, but it was a good distance. And then go out the other side and he would follow the track. And he said that dog followed it perfectly. He went in right where the person entered. He followed right where the person went down the creek bed. And he said it was interesting. The dog was putting his nose in the water, dipping it down and scenting down in there, and then would come back up. And then the dog came right out of the creek, right where the person had. So it was really amazing. So that is definitely a myth. And in fact, there are cadaver dogs, or I call them human remains dogs, which we talked about a little bit in Killer Secrets. And those dogs, there's some that are certified for water recovery. If there's a victim who has drowned, the dog will go out on a boat and they will lean over the side of the boat and they will alert when they smell that person's scent. And then divers know roughly where to go down and recover remains. So that's just a great example of dogs can actually smell quite well through water and quite deep. I mean, to me, that's amazing that they can smell
Yeah.
down at the bottom of a lake or, anything like that. So it's
That
definitely a
reminds
myth.
Yeah, the other thing that reminds me of is, which makes sense to me, but I'm curious for your perspective on, a dog can follow a scent to a certain point and then it disappears, and the assumption is that it was because the person got in a car and drove away. Is that true? Is in that case, would a scent trail just end suddenly, or would it kind of peter out? How does that work?
That is another great question because I actually asked our trainer about that because you do hear about that. Like the dog tracked, they got in a vehicle, they left, track was over. And her answer, this was our other trainer, and she worked as a deputy and a canine handler, was that for a long time, they just never trained the dogs to keep following that track. So the dog would say, oh, okay, this is what I'm trained to do. I get to the end of the track. This is what I'm trained to do. So there's the end. They're starting to realize they need to actually add into the training. And it would be really fascinating to find out what they would do to start training the dogs differently, but they need to add in that the dog would continue following the track from a vehicle. So, because they can certainly do it. It's not a matter of they can't do it. It's more a matter of training. Bloodhounds, I think, would receive more of that training. They track for miles and miles, and they believe their ears, when they put their nose down, those big floppy ears, push the scent up into their nose, and then they have all those wrinkles, and it just holds the scent, and they can just track for miles. And so I think I read a bloodhound track for 130 miles, and I believe it was a kidnapping victim who had been picked up and driven away, and that dog followed the tracks. So they're certainly very capable of doing it. It's just a matter of making sure in the training that they can, that they start doing more of that. And I think that has changed. And I do believe that you're going to see more of that where the dogs do follow the tracks.
It does seem as if, at least it would make sense to me, just from a completely novice point of view, that the dog would reach the point where the person got into a vehicle and then would at least somehow indicate what direction the vehicle went in, which would be, you can imagine there would be all sorts of interesting tension to be built up on that, that now the investigator knows that they headed west afterwards, and either that's true or not true. But yeah, knowing that that's a possibility opens up some fun options.
It does. It definitely does. And what can make it hard for a dog to keep a track? So if you're wanting to make it where the dog's having a hard time with the track, it can be environmental factors, mostly wind, because if the wind is blowing the scent, the dog might be tracking. Like if the person was tracking along the road, that scent might be blowing it off onto the shoulder, and it could be harder for them to maintain that scent.
Mhm.
The other thing is if you're tracking in an urban environment and there's a lot of traffic, that traffic can start that airflow. Again, it's kind of like when that airflow can start moving around, swirling around, and making it hard for the dog to maintain the track. But that being said, if you're a good trainer, you're going to go out and train in those situations so that the dog starts learning how to sort through that tough environment. And they do. They amaze me. I go out and work them. I've worked my dogs in wind where we've gone around vehicles to see if there's narcotics in them. And You always worry that you're gonna get the wrong vehicle because of the direction of the wind, and the dogs have always been spot on because we go out and try to train in those situations. And then as a handler, you learn how to work through those situations. So, but they're really amazing what they can do. And the other reason they might lose a track is if a lot of people come and walk over the track. And
Mhm.
that's usually for the dogs training to find the hottest scent. So that means that if they didn't know who I was and I robbed a store and I took off, the dog can actually come and say, "This was the last scent here, and I'm going to track it." And as long as there's not a lot of foot traffic going back and forth across, messing up that hot scent, they can find I've heard stories of dogs tracking right to criminals' front doors and, that's what's fun about it is when it comes to our books, we can add in as much conflict or make it as easy as we want, depending on what we need to happen and have happen in the story. So
Yeah. The whole idea that people are shown presenting some kind of article of clothing or something like that that belong to the person they're trying to track. Is that in fact how that works?
So that's the other way of tracking. So that's called a scent article. And you're absolutely right. So then that would be more if I suddenly was hiking in the mountains and didn't come back and they would use a scent article, a jacket from my car or something like that, and tell the dogs to go find that specific scent. And in that case, you can keep having them smell it, that scent article, and they can keep tracking it. So it's kind of two different ways of tracking. In my books, I opted to make my fictional dog do both ways. In real life, again, ask your agency, but most police agencies are going to have the dogs track the hottest scent. Most search and rescues are going to have the dogs track off a scent article. They're going to learn that way. So,
Okay.
but I just thought for fiction purposes and book purposes, it, I liked having both ways. And I actually asked a canine trainer for one of our local agencies, and he said, "Oh, I've done both with my law enforcement dogs." He said it just depends on the dog.
Yeah.
So.
Well, it's interesting you were talking earlier about human remains dogs. And I've always been curious as to whether human remains dogs would, if it, they went to an earthquake zone or something like that, and they were in an area, and the assumption was that this was at this point a recovery effort, not a rescue effort,
Mhm.
but there was a person still alive. Do the dogs respond to that at all?
That's a great question. I believe they would. Now, a lot of those dogs who go into, say, like FEMA dogs, I believe they do train off both live scent, so someone who's still alive, and then someone who's deceased. So I believe they train the dog to find both for that reason. They want to find everyone. And certainly if you can find someone who's still alive, that's just a huge, amazing thing. So a lot of the true cadaver dogs or human remains dogs, it depends on the agency, but I was talking to my friend who helped me with Killer Secrets, and she said it also depends on if they're being used for law enforcement. And if you have to go to court, then they try to keep the dog mainly trained to find just the human remains.
Mhm.
But that being said, I think the dogs know, that what they're tracking and what they're trying to find. And so I certainly think it's a possibility. I wouldn't rule it out. But definitely the rescue recovery dogs, the dogs working like at 911 and any kind of FEMA dog, they train them to find both live and deceased uh, remains. So
And do you know how they train cadaver dogs?
I do. It varies. So our trainer in Oklahoma, I asked him about it. He did some cadaver dog training, and he said he quit doing it after he realized he would go to the local hospital. They knew he was the dog trainer. He told him what he wanted. They would give him, bloody gauze, or he even had some, I think, like some fingers and just some things like that. He said he was driving home one day and thought, thinking about everything he had in his trunk. And if he got pulled over, he would have a lot of explaining to do.
That right there
Uh,
is a story. If anyone's like searching for a story to
yeah,
write, there you go.
it is. It's part of what kind of prompted Killer Secrets, that story. But nowadays, so he was probably training and doing that 15, 20 years ago where the hospitals weren't so regulated. So now my understanding is you have to put in a special request, and there's labs and whatnot. You can get human remains from bone, tissue, blood, anything you're trying to teach the dog to find. Because when we pass away, our scent changes. So the remains will smell different whether we're alive or deceased. So they need the tissue from someone who is deceased. They need the bones from someone who's deceased. So you can put in for a special permit regulation, you get them, and then you have apparently you have a separate freezer. Of course, you would want a separate freezer. You don't want that with your other stuff, but it's locked and marked. It has to be marked specifically and all that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
it's not quite as loose as it was when our trainer did it. Gosh, I bet that was 20 years ago he was doing that. So
Yeah, and I realize it's not really like you could use a, roadkill or something like that because you don't wanna train the dog to find, like, every dead chipmunk that happens to be in the bushes to the side of the path. It has to be very specific.
it
But
does, and
for
those would
humans,
have a different odor.
yeah.
So, yeah, yeah. So, yeah, you wanna in fact, I'm sure they test. I would think when they certify, they're gonna put out the human remains that the dog should be finding and then maybe some things like roadkill to make sure the dog is alerting on the correct thing, because you could be affecting a case, you could be affecting a search and rescue operation, recovery operation, that kind of stuff. So those dogs really do have to be spot on.
Yeah. When a dog alerts, is it, the case that the trainer trains the dog to do a certain thing, or is it the trainer watching for a signal that's specific to that dog and just recognizing that that's the dog's way of alerting?
Great question. So when the dogs are trained to find something, we'll just say drugs, when they start catching an odor of a drug, their body language will change. And this is true whether they're tracking a criminal or a human remains dog or whatever kind of dog we're talking about. So we say they're in odor and their body language changes. They get a little more tense, their tails go up. It's just something you have to kind of get to know each dog. But I can tell when my dogs are sniffing, say, another dog, or when they've found the scent of marijuana.
Mhm.
And then from there, once the dog is trained, you're going to teach them how you want them to indicate. So there's two different types of alerts. There's a passive alert and there's a active alert. Passive could be the dog sitting or laying down. Active alert is the dog will scratch. I think more and more, I don't see as many agencies with active alert dogs because it destroys evidence. In our case, we had some active alert dogs that left scratches on vehicles. And most of the time we found something. And so we kind of was like, well, you shouldn't have had marijuana at school. So you have to live with the scratches. But there was one time we didn't find anything. And so we ended up paying for that car to get buffed out and repainted basically because it was the
Whoops.
little dog who did that. And she was quite an intense little lab and left quite a few little, she just, so most of the time, like my dogs are all passive alert now. And especially in law enforcement, they wanna make sure they're not scratching and messing up evidence.
Yeah.
And one of our trainers, the one who worked for the Colorado, department, who was a deputy, she had her dog lay down to indicate he found evidence and sit to indicate he found narcotics, and I thought that was just so amazing. So I stole that, and I put that in my book. So the credit goes to her and her training because that was something I didn't realize, officers did, and that may have been her own deal. I don't know. I should ask her sometime.
How do you go about training the dog to recognize what it is that you want them to be alerting on? So let's say for drugs, I don't know if there are canines that are just drug dogs or they're trained to a specific kind of drug. And then I would think early on they would be like excited about almost everything. And so how can you tell them to be like, okay, just calm down because that's not what you need to be alerting on?
Yeah, you definitely when you start a young dog, there's always a phase where you're right, they get excited about everything and they want their toy. So they're like, "Oh, I'll just alert here. And maybe I'll get it." But to back up, we look for certain characteristics before we even start training. Those characteristics are extremely high energy. And I'm talking really high energy. I always laugh. I've gone and tested out dogs that were high energy and I'm like, "No, your dog is not high energy." But they fetched the ball twice. That's not good enough. We need a dog who's gonna fetch it 20 times or, just even if they get tired, they might just hold the ball and just be like, let me catch my breath and then you can throw it for me again. That's the kind of dog we're looking for. They have to put up with different floor surfaces. They have to be willing to get up on things like couches or tables. And so I'm sure when I went in and tested out different rescues, I'm sure the people working with the dogs to have better behavior hated it when I came in because I would be like, hey, are you willing to get up on this couch? Will you put your paws up on the table? Will you, do this? But we need them to be comfortable with that. So once I know that they're going to pass all those tests, then I would go out and they have that high retrieve drive. They wanna play, they're obsessed by that toy, and I start teaching them that, "Hey, when you find this odor, the toy is gonna be there." And so what I might do is, say, take some marijuana because it's a nice stinky odor, it's a real easy odor out of all the drugs to kind of for them to start putting the game together and put the toy with that and make it real easy at first, but like, "Hey, go find it. Oh, there's your toy right there. There's your," and then you make it a little harder and a little harder, and they have to start, tracking it a little bit more and up high and down low and in grass and in the wind and just lots of different environments until they learn how to use their nose to go out and find that and places to put their nose to go check. And once they do that, once they have that part of the game down pretty well, then you start teaching the indication like, well, now you have to sit before you get your toy. And I'm laughing because my older girl, I have a yellow lab willow, and throughout her whole career, you could tell she was like, she's such a smart dog. And she was like, you know what? This having to sit to get my toy? No. I told you where it was. You just give me my toy.
That's
And of
funny.
course, legally, we need them to sit and indicate. So that was something I always had to work with her on. And she's funny because at schools, she'll sniff, look at me, and then just like roll her eyes and be like, fine, I'll sit.
Be that way.
Be that way, fine. She was the only one over the years who ever thought that process through. It was really interesting. And I even had her hips checked out and everything to make sure she wasn't sore, but nope, she just knew. She just was like, "Well, I found it. I just should get my toy." And
She was
having to
negotiating.
she was. She is a very much a negotiator. So that's an overview of the training process. And of course, there's a lot of different things in between all of that, but
And how
that's the
old is a dog
basic.
normally? Like, when would you start training a dog? And at what point would you feel like, now, yes, this is a dog who can operate productively in the real life scenario?
Yeah, so we always looked for them when they were about a year old because by then their personalities and behavior and everything is pretty much in place. If they have a high retrieve drive, they're probably always going to have a high retrieve drive. I went to a lot of rescues because I always felt like those dogs were the ones that ended up in a rescue because they're very difficult to live with. So I'm laughing because I'm like, yeah, we have rules in our house because they are not easy to live with. Um, But I have heard, I mean, Boulder County Sheriff received a bloodhound puppy as a donation, and they started him young, and he just certified. I think he's a year and a half old now, and he just finished his certification, and it sounds like his handler did lots of little games with him and kind of through puppyhood, but you don't always know if they're gonna keep the characteristics you need. Some of them actually lose that retrieve drive. They calm down, I always hear people say, "Oh, he's still acting like a puppy, but now he calmed down." Well, we don't want ours to calm down. We
So
need
do you
him to
not want
still.
them to calm down because they might be in a situation where they're going to need to keep going for a long time? Or is the fact of them being that energetic, is that indicative of some deeper characteristic that's desirable for dogs doing this work?
Yeah, it's a little bit of both. It's the drive is what I would say. It's when they're that energetic, they have really good drive. They have that prey drive. They just wanna go out there and work, 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 and do something. It is also indicative of how long they're gonna be able to work. Now, that being said, even the most high energy dogs are gonna need a break. As their handler, you get to know them and you have to respect their limitations. But I had a dog named Gracie, and she'd be working for an hour, and I'd be like, "You need a break?" And she'd look at me like, "No, I don't."
Yeah.
I'd make her take a 10-minute break, and then she was right back out there. I'm like, "Okay." Most dogs aren't quite that. She was a little bit of an exception to the rule. Most of the
Yeah.
dogs, need breaks after 20, 30 minutes. at least for what we do. So, but yeah, you want that high prey drive. Yeah.
And this is sort of looping back to an earlier point you made that there are also these you were saying about using marijuana because it had a very distinctive odor. And there's also this trope of, we pack the drugs in coffee beans or something like that. Can you talk about that a little bit in terms of, is that a mistake writers make, or is that true?
It is not true that you can hide it in coffee beans or anything like that. I always say if you really want the dog to miss something, you need to pay off the handler because so if you're writing a mystery and you want your dog to miss something, maybe the handler's not on the up and up because we can mess up and pull them off a scent. But dogs have an amazing olfactory system. And what that means is when they smell, I always use the analogy we walk into a pizza parlor and we're like, oh, it smells like pizza. The dogs would walk in, they'd be like, "Oh, I smell dough." And then I smell the flour, I smell the yeast, I smell, all the ingredients in the dough. They smell it like individual layers. I smell the sauce, I smell the cheese, I smell the pepperoni. And so what that means is when you hide coffee or drugs in coffee, they would come up, smell the coffee and be like, "I smell coffee. I smell meth. I'm going to alert." So there's no way to cover up that odor. So that is a common myth and it was really funny. We subscribed for years to a magazine called High Times, and there was an ad in there, and the reason why we subscribed is we try to keep up on different stash containers because the dogs might alert, and it's the human who misses it.
Mhm.
So there's stash containers, and so High Times it's an interesting magazine,
Yeah.
and they had a lot of advertisements for different ways to stash drugs, and we saw an ad once that said canine proof plastic bags. And we thought, well, we got to order these. We have to see what's canine proof. So we ordered them and they came and my business partner and I were like, this kind of just look like Ziploc baggies, but let's see how canine proof they are. We hid something in them and the dogs found it instantly. So I hate to break it to anyone who bought those baggies and no, sorry, High Times, but they were not canine proof.
It's
So
funny.
yeah.
The distribution lists you must be on.
I know. I was like, I'm probably on some watch list. My husband always jokes that he hates going to the airport with me because I'm probably on some watch list.
Yeah, exactly.
Between the book research and the drug dogs, he's certain. So,
Well, these questions about what can and can't throw a dog off a scent are interesting because I live in Chester County, Pennsylvania, outside Philadelphia. And a while ago, there was a guy who escaped from uh, a prison in the area. And he evaded the police for, I think, like 2 weeks. And they
wow,
would catch him on trail cams and things like that. He was spending some time in Longwood Gardens, which is a huge, like, botanical garden in the area.
interesting.
And they did have dogs, trying to track him. And I thought, oh, well, like the dogs are on the case now. Like, how long is he going to be out there? But he was still out there for a really long time. And I never heard anything about what the explanation was for how that happened. But if someone is a fugitive and they're trying to avoid the tracking dogs, do you have any tips for them of how they can do that?
Um, I would say I wouldn't go in a straight line. I would be weaving around a lot. Try to make that dog really work at having to keep up with you. Maybe going over fences and back over. And it's not that the dogs can't track it, but you're just making them work harder. If you go in a straight line, that's a much easier. They're just like, oh yeah, I got you. I'll be on it. You could. I have to think about how to say this. So you could go even up in a tree or something like that. Now the dogs will still find you. Your scent molecules will drop down. Your skin, you shed skin cells, those are going to drop down. But if you stayed there and then left again before the dogs came, your scent pool might just be there, and they might think, "Oh, they're up here, so I need to stop here." And then that handler needs to cast the dog out again and get back on the track. Sometimes as a handler, I can tell you, it's just trying to figure out where to start. So if they didn't know exactly where he was, the trail cams probably helped. My guess is if they caught him on the trail cam, they would be like, okay, let's at least take the dog there, see what
Yeah.
we have going. And my other question would be not knowing the case or the dogs or anything like that is if it's in an area again with a lot of foot traffic, that that can mess, but maybe it wasn't. So,
Yeah,
but
not in
that
this
can
case.
make it harder.
I hope that somebody writes a book about it because it was fascinating. And they even had video of him, in retrospect, when they realized he was gone, they looked back at the video. His name was Cavalcante. I can't remember what his first name was, but they had video of him. He climbed up there was a brick wall and he put his hands on wall and his feet on the other. And he kind of Spider-Man
Yeah.
up between the walls. And then he got on the roof and somehow from the roof got over the fence. And it cracked me up because I kind of hope somebody in a position of authority hears this, but the law enforcement officer who was directing the whole search and rescue thing kept saying, "This guy isn't smart. He thinks he's smart, but he's not." And I'm like, "Dude, don't say that because you've been looking for him now for 10 days and haven't found him. So if he's
Yeah.
not smart, that's probably not the message you want to be sending out to people about the people who are trying to track him down." But it was fascinating. But I do think that it was dogs that eventually did help. I mean, I know there was a dog on the case when they did finally,
Yeah.
he had fallen asleep after 2 weeks on the run. He had fallen asleep and
Oh,
they happened upon him while he was actually sleeping. But it was a fascinating story. I hope somebody delves into more detail about that.
that does sound fascinating. And now that you said he went up on roofs and stuff like that, that's about as good as you're gonna get to
Yeah.
not get rid of the scent, but make it harder. You're making it a lot harder on the dogs to track that scent. So,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess it would be yeah, well, I'm waiting for the book to come out. Maybe I'll start writing it
Yeah,
myself.
yeah. You
I
should,
find it
go
so
for it.
fascinating.
I wanna read your book on it.
We've been talking a lot about labs, but oftentimes you hear shepherds or shepherd mixes being dogs that are doing this. But then you also see like beagles at the airport
Mhm.
sniffing baggage on the baggage carousel. So, how do people match the breed of dog with the type of work that they want them to do?
That's a great question. So you really have to think about the job you want. And so, for instance, in our case, a drug dog could be a shepherd, it could be a Malinois, it could be a lab. I had a Russell Terrier who was one of the best drug dogs I ever had.
I can
So
believe
any
that. As a person with a
Oh
terrier,
yeah.
I believe that.
Oh, he was fantastic. I called him my undercover agent. He had more drug busts. And I don't know, I feel like it was just because he was that exceptional, but sometimes too, I think people didn't take him seriously. and, and so then maybe they didn't flush their stuff down the toilet or something. But
It's just a
um,
terrier.
me. But it really comes down to, like, in our case, we're going into schools and businesses and we want to be non-intimidating. So we have the labs, we have the terriers we've used over the years because, again, like I was just saying, if you saw Sparky, you're not intimidated by him. He was my little terrier,
The
Sparky. But if you brought the dog like the Malinois behind me on my book cover in, all of a sudden you're a little more at attention, right? You're like, oh, I better stand a little straighter. That's a little more intimidating. That dog
Right.
might bite me. That dog might be trained to, do something like that. So law enforcement will often have the more intimidating breeds because they need that. Because when they find someone who's been on the run for 2 weeks, they need a dog that is going to convince someone just to say, okay, never mind. And they need a dog who, when they do bite, is going to help them get control and help a suspect become compliant because you're not deploying a dog to bite or apprehend someone unless something's really going wrong.
Mhm.
Your average arrest is not going to have a dog hanging off of someone's arm. So when you think about the scale of what police officers use as far as like, just being in uniform and their presence to all the way up to like an officer involved shooting, the dogs are actually pretty high up on that scale. And if you're deploying a dog, that officer has gotten into a really dangerous situation and it's not something you normally do. So you need the really intimidating dogs who are quite happy to go out and bite someone and hang on to that bite and help until they can get a suspect in handcuffs and everyone's safe. So breeds really vary. I mean, little Sparky, he thought he was tough, but he's not going to go out and take down a big criminal. But a Malinois will. So that is definitely something to research. A lot of bomb dogs are labs, and I think it's because they're out in public places. You see them at like the Super Bowl. You see them. I've seen them at our baseball games or football games. With the professional sports, and they're in with the public. You want them to be non-intimidating. So it really varies. TSA, I've seen them use the pointers. I've seen them use labs. Um, The beagles come into play a lot of times at airports for food. They're really good at finding food. They're not always the best drug dogs, which is
Uh-huh.
interesting to me, but they love finding food. They're little food hounds. And so you see them a lot at customs and you see them finding things coming in. The USDA has pretty strict regulations about what can come in and not come into our country from other countries. And they're right there checking everything, making sure everyone's on the up and up. So
Yeah.
yeah.
And how about what happens when the dog flunks out of a program? What would cause that,
Yeah.
and then what happens to that animal?
So we've had a couple flunk outs over the years. We had the first one we had was a border collie mix. And literally he was smart enough to say he would check like 10 lockers. And you have to understand when we go into school, we're probably going to check 500 lockers. I mean, it depends on how often they alert, but if you're just going through, you're checking a lot. So he would check like 10, 20 lockers and then just say, if you lost it, you should find it. So his nose was great. His drive was great. He just was like, I don't need to keep working for something you lost.
It's
um,
interesting.
yeah, I mean,
I
he
think
could
of
just
border
tell.
collies as being kind of like obsessively
Yeah.
wanting to work more and more.
Well, and that's why we thought when we found him, oh, this is going to be a great dog. He's a lab border collie mix. He's got that border collie drive. He's going to be fantastic. Well, he wasn't. And so we found a home for him. He actually ended up we have a dog massage therapist who works on all our dogs, and so, maybe he was well, he obviously was the smartest out of everyone because he got to go live with her, and he probably got massages all the time, so he'd probably tell my dog, "See how much smarter I was?" And then we've had some that just couldn't handle the environment of a school. You go into a middle school and you have, kids who get really excited to see dogs. And one of the things I like to do just as far as coming in and community outreach and things we look for is teaching kids how to properly approach a dog because the kids get really excited and they see my dogs and they come running and it's a dog. And I'm like, well, just stop. Let me teach you how to properly approach a dog you don't know and a working dog. And we do allow the kids to pet our dogs. So, but our dogs have to put up with that situation, which is a lot of stress and not every dog can handle it. So we had another one flunk out. He never got aggressive. He just was scared and I don't blame him. I told him middle schoolers can be scary. So
I agree with
so we
that.
yeah. So we found a home for him and he was quite happy just to be a dog. So they did flunk out once in a while, but we've been pretty lucky over the years that most of them have worked out.
I always think it's interesting to see, every once in a while I'll run across an article about um, service dogs like seeing eye dogs who don't make the cut, fail the bunny test or whatever, and then are offered for adoption as a pet. And I thought that's probably the best behaved pet you could get, except for they know how to open the refrigerator or something like that.
Mhm.
Like if they've already learned some of those things, like you were saying, the willingness to put their paws on the counter or to jump up on tables and things like that. You probably want to get them before they've learned that, or they'd always be like turning your lights on and off or something like that.
They are. We've had some interesting experiences with the retired dogs because you can't, well, when they're working, part of the reason they can't just live in the house like a pet is I can't say you're in trouble if you get up on the couch or if you get up and check the counter or something, if you because that's your training. That's what I encourage you to do. So it's funny. We'll have people over for the holidays or something, family, and the family has even learned the first time the dog jumped up, put their front paws up on the counter, and someone was ready to correct him. And I said, "Oh, good job. Good checking. Good job." And then I said, "Okay, now leave it and let's go outside."
Yeah,
Because,
yeah.
and we even caught little Sparky. He was so funny. We learned that when he was retired and loose in the house, we had to push the chairs in at our table. Otherwise, he knew how to jump up on the chair, jump up on the table. And my husband came in one day and he was trotting around the table, cleaning up little crumbs and then he saw my husband and he froze like, "You don't see me."
Oh, he knew. He knew he
He
was being
knew.
bad.
He knew. We had been working with him on, "You don't do this anymore." But, when he was working, we were at a middle school dance and the drinks had been spiked and I put him up on the table and he went down the table and was like, this drink. Because we train our dogs to find alcohol, which is a little, since we do schools. And he was like, this drink is spiked and this one and this one. And so, I mean, he had done that throughout his career. And he thought, well, why should this change?
Funny. It would be difficult to have him at a cocktail party. He'd be wanting to
It was.
turn everybody in.
Yes. Yes.
So I wanted to also ask about the human side of this. So I can imagine, and this would vary, I imagine, very much from circumstance to circumstance. But let's use your circumstance where you're going to schools and you're with a dog who's looking for drugs or alcohol. What training do the people have, not specific to the dogs, but specific to the people in the environment? So if you're searching lockers and there's like a group of middle school kids hanging around and the dog alerts at a locker, like, can you just describe how you as an individual handle that situation as you're managing the dynamics with the other people there?
Sure. So there's a lot of factors. One is the handler has to go through a lot of certification and training just to work the dog. The second part of that certification and training is understanding what you can and can't do as far as Fourth Amendment rights within the school setting. So, for example, if there were a group of kids around hanging around the lockers, and this is specific to a school setting. So if anyone's using this video for research, this would be for what I do personally. I would probably wait for those kids to leave or I would go somewhere else. And the reason for that is our dogs do not alert on people because the Supreme Court ruled that having a dog sniff and alert on a person is the same thing as a strip search. So while our dogs can smell it on someone and they might, I always used to joke, Sparky would be like, you, I see you. And I could tell the schools, well, we feel like checking some pockets. That might be a good kid to, to check. But that's up to the school. That's not up to me. So if there's a group of kids or it's passing period, I just hang out and I just try to be visible. If there's a group of kids, like a class out doing a activity in the hallway, I might just say hello, be visible because again, that presence, we're trying to deter drugs, alcohol, and gunpowder at schools. They see us, they hopefully say, "Oh, the dog was here. We should, let's make good choices." That's what I always tell them. Let's make better choices. And then I'll go to another part of the school that doesn't have anyone there, that's empty, and check lockers. I often have an administrator with me. So if we do classrooms, the administrator will ask the students to leave the classroom and then we go in and check their belongings. Um, I'm trying to think of other scenarios. Parking lots are always interesting because if a student parks on school grounds, that parking lot belongs to the school. So the Supreme Court has ruled that basically you're renting that spot and I have the right to come out and check vehicles. So I might, just go out and I do random checks. And so what that means is like if someone says, well, we suspect a black truck. Okay, well, hopefully there's more than one black truck. If not, I'll just go check all the trucks in the parking lot. Um, so there's a lot of different scenarios you get yourself into that you have to know the Fourth Amendment rights. And then those are great questions to ask if you're doing book research, because again, every agency is different. For instance, at the airport, if I had something on my person, those dogs probably are. I'm going to just assume, I don't know this 100% for certain, but I'm sure Homeland Security overrides any sort of, and we're willingly there. Unlike kids that are mandated to go to school, that was part of the Supreme Court's decision with the searches and not allowing a dog to sniff a kid out of school is because they're legally forced to be there. At an airport, it's our choice to be there, right? We're going on vacation or we're flying to a writers' conference, wherever. And that was our choice. We bought the ticket. We're in the security line. Those dogs, if you have something on your person, they're going to alert on you. And then you're going to be taken away and searched. So there's a lot of different scenarios. Um, and so I encourage writers out there to learn about more about the Fourth Amendment cases that have gone to the Supreme Court concerning dogs, because there's actually been a few. Um, especially for law enforcement. And can you use a dog? Like, could they just show up with a canine and check around my house if they thought I had a drug lab? The Supreme Court said, no, you can't do that. But it's a fascinating thing to read. So it is important. That would be a great research question, depending again, what agency you're using, what you want to have happen. Is this a legal search? Is this an illegal search? And you could certainly do an illegal one as a plot point to,
Yeah.
have the case thrown out or have a canine handler get fired or whatever you want to do with that. So
Yeah. If all our books were about everybody following the letter of the law, they would be pretty boring books.
they would be. Yeah. Yeah. So it is kind of fun to play with that.
So if someone is interested in researching this for their own book, are there any suggestions you have for how to go about this? Like, I always wanted to be the person that hid in the woods so that the dog could come look for me. I don't know if there's some qualification you need to be the person who goes and hides in the woods or, gets buried under the snow or whatever. Maybe I wouldn't pick that, but it does seem like fun. But where would you point people if they're interested in getting more information about this?
Sure. So what I would do is I would one figure out what agency you want, then go to their public information officer, assuming it's a law enforcement agency. If it's a private agency like ours, you can just reach out to me. But I would go to the public information officer and say, this is what I'm writing. Is there a canine handler willing to talk to me? Usually, canine handlers, we love talking about our dogs. We're so proud of our dogs and we love telling stories. The only time I heard of a rider having any kind of a hard time finding a connection was TSA with the airports. And that probably just has to do with security but when it comes to that, you could probably just get some basic dog information and use it if that's the agency you want to use in your book. I'm also happy at my website, KathleenDonnelly.com. People are welcome to reach out. I don't know everything about every type of working dog, but I at least could help someone get started. So if someone really was stuck, I would be happy to try to help them. But public information officers are great and they can usually connect with canine handlers and it's a great way. In fact, I have a wonderful person I use for my books because my protagonist is a Forest Service law enforcement officer and canine handler. And it took me a while to find a real canine handler in the Forest Service. And it was through their public information office that I was able to connect with him. So those are always great routes because those officers, the information officers know who is doing what and who would be willing to talk with you.
Yeah.
So,
So
yeah.
great. Well,
Yeah.
Kathleen, thank you so much. I could talk about
Thanks.
dogs for hours, but
Me too.
I appreciate the information you shared. And please let everyone know where they can go to find out, not only to contact you, to find out more about you and your books and everything you do online.
Well, thanks so much. Definitely in the website is a great place to start. I also have a monthly newsletter and the sign up is on the website. And if you sign up, you get my free ebook called Working Tales, the stories behind the canines. I'm on social media, mostly Facebook and Instagram are great ways to connect. And otherwise, my newsletter and my website are fantastic. So,
Very good. Thank you so much.
yeah, thank you.
I hope you enjoyed my conversation with Kathleen. What was the most surprising piece of information she shared about working canines? I would love to hear your thoughts. Just leave a comment on YouTube, and while you're at it, please subscribe. And if you got value from this episode and were thinking, I wish I could buy Maddie a cup of coffee, you can do that. Scroll to the bottom of any page at theindyauthor.com and click Buy Me a Coffee. Until next time, here's wishing you favorable winds and smooth sailing on your creative voyage.